We are pleased to welcome you to the TIC Council webinar. We're entitled The Contribution of the TIC Sector to Cybersecurity, Implementation Opportunities and Challenges of the European Cybersecurity Act. My name is Martin Michelot. I am the Policy and International Affairs Manager at the TIC Council. And it's a pleasure to welcome you all today to discuss this very interesting and very topical issue, which we will be discussing for the next hour. Before we jump into the issue, I want to use this opportunity to tell you what the TIC Council is, because perhaps some of you do not know the TIC Council. And for those of you who are new to the TIC Council, we're very pleased to have you online. The TIC Council is born from the merger of the former global TIC industry organizations, IFIA and SEOC, which brings together a total of about 90 member companies and organizations that are active in more than 160 countries, which span every continent and speak with one voice worldwide. The TIC Council has its head office in Brussels, where I am sitting, and it also has an office in Washington and a presence in India, and is in the process of building a presence in China. So we are an international organization representing the testing, inspection, and certification, third-party testing, inspection, and certification companies, and we have one representative from one of our members here today. And I also am sharing with you the mission of the TIC Council, which you can see on your screen. So as the voice of the global independent testing, inspection, and certification industry, the TIC Council engages governments and key stakeholders to advocate for effective solutions that protect the public, support innovation, and facilitate trade. So this is for our mission and for the TIC Council. And I will also now introduce today's speakers who will take the floor in the order that I present them. So here you already have on the screen Aristotelis Tsafalias, who is the Policy Officer for Cybersecurity and Digital Privacy Policy at DG Connect. Welcome, Aris. Thank you for being here today. We will then have Andreas Mitrakas, who is the head of the Data Security and Standardization unit at ENISA, and Andreas is sitting in Athens. And from SGS, Sergio Lomban, who is the Vice President for Digital Trust Services and who is in Geneva. So we have an international webinar to discuss EU cybersecurity with speakers in Brussels, in Athens, in Geneva. So I look forward to a very, very fruitful and important discussion. Each speaker will give a 12 to 15-minute presentation, and we will follow up with a Q&A session. For all of you who are in attendance, feel free to use the Q&A button in the WebEx application to use questions. I will be collecting them, and I will be asking the speakers to get to some of your questions. Aristotelis, the floor is yours. Thank you again for all the speakers for accepting our invitation. Thank you to all the attendees for being here today. And Aris, on to you.
Yes. Thank you, Martin. Thank you for the invitation. And of course, I'm very happy to be here because the companies represented by the TIC Council, one may argue, are at the heart or one of the hearts of the Cybersecurity Act and the European Cybersecurity Certification Framework. Now, just to put things in some context and perspective, the Cybersecurity Act is one of the many, let's say, policy instruments that we have in place at European level to address cybersecurity and digitalization of society and the risks that come with it. So going a few years back, although sometimes it feels like a lifetime, in 2013 we had the EU cybersecurity strategy. In 2016, the NIS directive came into force, and the Cybersecurity Act, the proposal, was published along with other initiatives in what we call the cybersecurity package in 2017, in September of 2017. and it entered into force in June of 2019. And anyway, we were surprised by how quick the negotiation went, and perhaps that is testament to the difference in how EU stakeholders viewed cybersecurity back in 2013 and the importance we attribute to cybersecurity now. If we can move to the next slide. Now, cybersecurity remains on our political agenda. It was mentioned in the first quarter when we published the strategy for our so-called digital strategy, Europe Fit for the Digital Age. It remains a key pillar in a communication we published just a couple of weeks ago on the path to recovery and sustainability after the COVID crisis. And of course, towards the end of the year, we expect a major development being the review of the NIS directive. For those of you who may not know the NIS directive, it was the first piece of legislation that put in place security measures, the requirements for security measures in a broad range of industries, but also asked our member states to develop certain cybersecurity capabilities. So the European cybersecurity framework. Well, the starting point is that as digitalization of society continues to grow, we need to make sure that these technologies, these products, we use more and more often, and as the crisis shown, we depend on them to continue living and working. So we need to improve cybersecurity in these products and services. Now, of course, in Europe, we have the particular, let's say, challenge of the single market. We want to make sure that when rules are put in place for products and services, those rules are common across the single market, so we don't create either internal barriers to trade, so we don't increase regulatory burden, and that, again, we have a unified voice also on the global market in these areas. The other point that we quickly saw when developing the European Cybersecurity Certification Framework is that we need schemes. We cannot have just one scheme, and a scheme is essentially an association of standards, requirements, and evaluation methods. We cannot just have one scheme for all products out there, for all risk levels out there. We decided to start with a voluntary approach, so the establishment of these schemes do not immediately create an obligation for vendors or service providers to certify their products. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, the Cybersecurity Act entered into force in June 2019. Now we are proceeding with its implementation. I think it's maybe today or tomorrow, it'll be exactly 1 year since the entry into force. So the implementation starts with the establishment of 2 advisory groups, or groups that will advise the Commission on matters of certification. The first one is the European Cybersecurity Certification Group, with representatives of national cybersecurity certification authorities, things like the National Cryptographic Center in Spain, ANSSI in France, BSI in Germany, etc. So that has been established, and we've met about 5 times so far. And we have another important, of course, group, the Stakeholder Cybersecurity Certification Group. Unfortunately, there, a combination of transition in management and also the crisis led to a significant delay. But the good news is that the selection has finally taken place. And the first SCCG meeting will happen in a few days. And as you may have seen, well, some of you may have seen, there are representatives of TIC companies that have announced their selection. And I think, well, I don't know if it's a secret, but the TIC Council was also selected as a participant in the SCCG, and congratulations on that, Martin, and looking forward to working with you very soon. Now, in terms of actual scheme preparation, the Commission has issued an ESA, represented today here by Andreas, a request to prepare 2 schemes. The first one I've indicated in the slides there in air quotes is what we call the successor to the SOGIS Mutual Recognition Agreement. So it's a scheme built around common criteria. The second scheme is that on cloud services. Now, looking a bit forward towards the future, the Cybersecurity Act provides for a document which we call the Union Rolling Work Programme for European Cybersecurity Certification. That document was supposed to be published in June of this year, 1 year after the entry into force, but due to the delay of the establishment of the SCCG and the role that the SCCG plays in the preparation of this document, its publication has been pushed forward to later this year. Next slide, please. However, the Union Rolling Work Programme for European Cybersecurity Certification, as I mentioned, is, let's say, the document, the vehicle that will capture what we plan to do next. It will do so in setting out what we call strategic priorities linked to certification. Among those priorities are, of course, as one would expect, standardization. So there is a close link, as everyone knows, between standards and certification. Standards that express requirements, standards that detail how those requirements must be assessed, which I assume are particularly important to members of the TIC industry to have a good, understandable standards that lay out how you most likely will be expected to demonstrate that the products meet the requirements related to cybersecurity. A strategic priority in certification.
We lost Aris for
testing of a product, but also look into how we can assess the vendor's activities related to the design, development, delivery, and maintenance of an ICT product. An important factor or priority is to get what we call risk-based assurance right. So to make a coherent, let's say, association between what we perceive as risk and how we then go about assessing that the requirements have been met. The idea is that depending on the risk, the assessment methods, the thoroughness of the assessment methods may differ. And what we want to do is try to set up a coherent system. So we have, let's say, a path, guidelines, given a certain degree of risk, a certain sector, a certain industry, we can easily identify how best to assess cybersecurity requirements. And of course, a strategic priority that is also, I assume, important to the TIC Council is the matter of international cooperation. So how do we make sure that while these schemes are European, so developed in Europe based on European law, we make sure that they are also open to the world, and we've also provided the possibility to sign agreements, mutual recognition agreements with other parts of the world, and of course there are certain conditions there, preconditions, things that I'm sure your members are very familiar with things on accreditation, governance of schemes, and all the conditions that need to be in place for one part of the world to trust the certification operations of another. Next slide, please. Now, the previous slide was about the so-called strategic priorities, and then the question is, okay, and what schemes are you going to be asking for in the future? There again, the Cybersecurity Act provides some guidance on how and in what areas future scheme requests may come from. And in requesting a scheme, we have to justify the request because the idea behind the European Cybersecurity Certification Framework is not to replace, let's say, well-functioning certification or standardization markets in standardization and certification markets, but to only intervene where there's a clear case for public intervention. So the first thing we need to take into account is the existence of national schemes in our member states. So these are schemes that are governed by national bodies. The idea there, of course, is to avoid fragmentation. So on cloud or in other areas, if one EU member state has developed a scheme or is developing a scheme and another one is doing the same, for us in the Commission, of course, the ideal is that we do not have 2, 3, 4, up to 27 national schemes, but we can agree on one European scheme to cover the needs of policymakers across the entire EU. The second is, of course, the second item that we take into account are developments in national or EU policy. So if there are policies that can benefit from certification, either at an EU level or at a national level, again, an EU scheme for us is the best answer. But we are also looking to understand from the market if there are instances where market players could benefit in a repeatable, standardized way of expressing and assessing cybersecurity related requirements, and there's a gap there for some reason that the market cannot fill. This is also a possibility for then us to intervene and establish an EU scheme for the benefit of the market. And finally, we are keeping an eye on emerging threats. So if something new comes up and we need a scheme to make sure that everybody is addressing this new threat in an appropriate manner, this may also lead to the request for a new scheme. But of course, all these 4 bullet points need to be documented and justified when we decide to intervene. So that's it from me as an introduction, and just like to reiterate the importance of the TIC sector for the well-functioning of the Cybersecurity Act and our eagerness to engage with you as we go forward. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Aris, for this comprehensive presentation, giving us the state of play on the implementation of the EU Cybersecurity Act and the related related acts that fall under it. I think this perfectly sets the tone for Andreas's presentation. Andreas from ENISA, who will be able to give us the perspective from ENISA. So Andreas, please, right on to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andreas Mitrakis. I work for ENISA in the area of cybersecurity certification. I started my involvement in this area soon after we received the first indications of this policy area requiring assistance and support by the agency. As you probably know, up until 2016, 2017, the involvement of ENISA in cybersecurity certification was very, very limited. But for all the right reasons, the proposals thereafter included a role for the agency, to the great pleasure, of course, of everyone who is involved on this side of policy. So in this presentation today, I just would like to give you an overview of the key tenets of the CSA, say a few things about the requests on the schemes that ENISA has been currently involved in, and just give you an indication of the vector where things are heading to in the next few months or so, or years. So maybe we can just skip to the next slide. I think Martin will need 4 clicks in total. Sorry about that. But in this introductory slide, I just wanted to underscore how important the cybersecurity policy area has been for you, for the governments of the member states. So the Council has coherently set out priorities around cybersecurity throughout 2019 and 2020, and there's good indications that the German presidency that follows in the second semester of 2020 will follow suit. This means that whatever instrument comes out in the area of cyber security needs to be taken into account and actuated in a way that produces meaningful policy outcomes. And bridging into the previous presentation by Aris, the cybersecurity certification is something very tangible we have in our hands. The schemes that are the outputs of the work that ENISA coordinates effectively become a part of the European legislation. So the schemes, what you and your members and your employers use, essentially will be the law. So there's no stronger instruments that public policy could devise in order to underscore the importance of the conformity assessment that happens in this area. On to the next slide. The key roles, as they're highlighted and outlined in the CSA, include the role for the member states, of course, which are the leading the engine of all this effort. The member states are coordinated by the Commission, as the Commission chairs this group, the European Cybersecurity Certification Group, that effectively lays out policy, and it confirms what the scope of these certification schemes will be all about. The ECCG acts upon the proposal of the Commission, which concerns the Union Rolling Work Programme, as well as everything else that goes around the definition of the policy areas that would eventually fall within the scope of this work programme. The Commission importantly manages comitology, which is the procedure in order to turn a scheme into law. Who else is important? Obviously, important people like you participate in the stakeholder cybersecurity certification group, where the views of certain institutional stakeholders, like the ones from representing the standardization community, as well as the private sector, sit together. And the chairing, of course, goes again to the Commission with some assistance from ENISA. ENISA gets a lead in drafting the candidates' scheme, so carrying out the technical work. And of course, ENISA is never alone when it carries out these tasks, as it is supported by what is called an ad hoc working group, experts, actually area experts. And of course, it has to interact with the member states that give out their opinion on the draft scheme produced by ENISA, in the scope of the ECCG. So on to the next slide, you can see this whole condivision of tasks in the swim lanes and this workflow diagram. I'm not so sure how readable it is, but on the one before the swim lane, which is the one before the lowest part of the screen, you have the commission that kicks off the union rolling work program process. It receives the advice of the stakeholders and the opinion of the member states through the two different organs. Then the flow passes on to ENISA, which advised as it will be by area experts in the form of the ad hoc working group and interacting with the community in the form of consultation, receiving advice from member states. It produces the candidate scheme. Then the candidate scheme on receives the opinion of the CCG, and it is handed alongside this opinion to the Commission for further approval within the scope of comitology. So an involving process that builds on relationship across multiple stakeholders, organized as they are in compartments and each serving a specific role. On to the next slide. Maybe we need one more click on this slide. Just see the beautiful SOGAS logo. It's important to keep in mind, as Aris suggested, that the first request about the scheme has been based on the mutual recognition agreement of the Senior Officers Group Information Security, the SOGAS acronym, therefore. This is in a very graphic form, the European interpretation of the common criteria international agreement that involves trade partners from across the globe. This effectively, when it came as a request, was one that required a lot of attention from ENISA because, as you can imagine, anything that was successful about it had to be preserved, and all the additional elements that were required under Article 54 of the Cybersecurity Act had to be, in addition, produced and added to the draft candidate scheme. A very involving process indeed. To our great fortune, we managed to attract the interest of knowledgeable experts in the field, in the area of that composed the ad hoc working group. And following a very brief period of processing that is just over 6 months, we'll be able to present the draft candidate scheme in its first form by the end of June. So just in July, we'll spend a fair amount of time interacting with the stakeholders in the form of consultation, and there you're all invited to consider submitting the feedback, possibly doing it through the association, of course, would help a lot the efforts of the college to process all the feedback that will be received. So that was the first attempt, the first exercise of this new area. The next one on cloud services has been based on good work led by the Commission, and usually called the CSP CERT, which brought together public and private sector representatives in the area of cloud services. So we pass from products onto services in the very involving and complex area of the cloud. Here the time frame is slightly more comfortable compared to the first request. But of course, there's always the time limitations when one seeks to get themselves organized in such a diverse area as the cloud. So far we've seen a bit of progress. Most of the questions had to do with the scoping and the level of that the scheme would address. Because of course, as you can imagine, that impacts directly the controls that would be proposed to be put in place. Clearly, these controls would have to serve primarily public interest in relation to end users, possibly consumers, public services, government services, this sort of thing. And of course, a lot will follow through alongside this frame as the work progresses. The goal for this scheme is to reach finalized draft stage by very late 2020. So November, probably December, we'll see the outcome of this work. On the next slide, we can present two notions on the same slide. The first one builds on the complementarity of the schemes. That is something that we're already considering. Here, one perhaps by just hear me talking, or even when in a couple, 3 weeks time, 2 weeks time, you'll have the chance to review the draft scheme yourselves. You might not come out so strongly. But on our design part of our heads, we already think that these schemes should work in a complementary manner, meaning that the product hardware layer should be receive such controls that facilitate their use for service layer. The service layer should work within specific strands of service, sometimes that might take different forms and facilitate different applications. So these components somehow will gradually be included in the schemes proposed by ENISA. From a different standpoint, we also think that there's also a bit of preparatory work that, again, it's a bit too soon to make it vividly visible. I could try, nevertheless, to describe it for you. On the background, you could imagine that we could start with a threat landscape taxonomy that could build on a risk assessment methodology, which could allow the vendors to designate the assurance level that they would like to seek for their products or services. And of course, by selecting the assurance level, then they could use or develop, as it would be for the case of ENISA, the appropriate set of controls for each particular scheme. So right now have colleagues, people that work already alongside this concept, trying to bring together the notions around risk assessments and assurance levels. The threat taxonomy would follow probably as from next year. So these are the key components of our work so far, the broad outline, of course. There's further areas that we would like to consider, and it concerns our relationship with the standardization organization, particularly in the area of gaps, evolving standards in a way that facilitates the use and implementation of the schemes, the management of intellectual property rights. There's risks there related to what ENISA does. And there's also concerns by the industry that if they participate in discussions in an ENISA forum, the degree of protection should make them feel comfortable about it. Formatting issues related to declaration of conformity, because some of those might be issued by members of the TIC Council. and so on. That's an important activity that is mandated under the CSA. So ENISA would develop those declarations of conformity and publish them on its website. So the challenges and opportunities for the implementation phase, of course, concern the new entrants into the markets. You'll see that many more member states are likely to develop such certification-related activities. We see countries like Poland moving from the consumer end to the scheme managing, scheme proposer, owner, and the market scope is broadening up. There's new opportunities, also business opportunities relate to a bigger chunk of the market that is going to pursue conformity assessments. You might see that public procurement will become much more organized and visible across the EU member states, because now they know what they need to, which requirements they need to meet. Obviously, when new entrants try to develop conformity assessment services, they would need to work with their learning curve and support their investments. So know-how, exchange of know-how and guidance and the evolution of these services across different markets might come into play. There might be niche opportunities in relation to assembly and distribution. So having conformity assessment developed side by side, perhaps with quality assurance of specific production or assembly lines that might be developed on Europe's edges, where imports happen from other continents, from Asia, for instance. And the broader public interest that still needs to be defined and quantified and taken into account, that is also likely to be components of everything we do. Because with time, I think people will gradually become far more sensitive to the need to acquire certified products and services in order to gain peace of mind, have better insurance coverage, and for all sorts of benefits that would stem from them. So on to our last slide with 2 clicks for the last bit of the presentation. As you can see, things would start with sound risk assessments that would fit and would prepare the ground for the content of a request or of a provision on the Union Rolling Work Program to produce a scheme. Then with expert inputs in a reasonable time frame, the draft candidate scheme would be presented. It would be voted through comitology, and then a very important phase would come in, which is the maintenance of the scheme. Of course, the implementation, but from our standpoint, it's the maintenance that counts, because all the gaps that you, your customers, member state governments, public service, and so on, stakeholders in the ecosystem highlight to us, would have to fit into the next edition of the scheme that would follow again the same cycle in up to intervals that last up to 5 years. So I think we're talking about an elaborate framework that we're just about scratching the surface at this point in time. Thank you for your attention. I'll be pleased to answer questions as they come along. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for this view from the trenches. Thank you very much for also giving us updates on the ad hoc groups and on the division of labor within ENISA. And I already see that there is quite a few questions that have been asked by in the Q&A form or outside of the Q&A form. So thank you also for your creativity in making sure that your questions are being received. The 2 presentations were absolutely complementary. So I am sure that the presentation from Sergio Lomban from SGS will follow in this vein. So Sergio, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Well, we can pass to the first slide. As you know, the TIC industry, it's always has been together with the regulation. It's part of our nature. Okay, so I'm and today I'm speaking not really as an SES, but also as a broader, as a member, a fellow member of the TIC industry. There is many values that the TIC industry is giving to the society. Many people ask me, what is the TIC industry giving to the cybersecurity? What is going to deliver over there? And my reply is always the same. We deliver whatever in many other regulations. Cybersecurity is not different from safety, from toys compliance, from medical devices, from electrical and electronic compliance. So the TIC industry has a long heritage of helping regulation to happen, okay? And we are not only helping our direct customer, the guy who is paying us. We are, I think, our real customers are governments, society, the consumers, yeah. But also it's very important, we are providing great support to the whole society. And this thing of the cybersecurity, can we go to the next slide, please? It's also more or less the same. Cybersecurity is super complex, honestly speaking. I'm guessing I'm not a super expert at my other colleagues. I'm basically starting to know all the details in the cybersecurity today, you know. But what I can identify is that cybersecurity is really complex because there are many players in the society, in the industry, in the economy that have different interests and different focus. Okay, and this is probably one of the realities, one of the main problems that we have today is that we have a lot of different players with different interests, and they sometimes are speaking about cybersecurity. They are not speaking about the same. Governments, for example, are moved by consumers' motivations, protecting industry and the consumers, the society in general. Okay. Consumers, in many cases, you know, consumers are not really aware about all the implications of cybersecurity. That's why, for example, today, starting to move more and more, but price is still a concern, meanwhile, cybersecurity, not really. Okay. The manufacturers of devices, they want to serve this market, these customers that today are still not really moved by cybersecurity or completely moved by cybersecurity. And then we have around the manufacturers a lot of players, people who is building subcomponents and that sometimes they have a lot of pressures by the manufacturers, yeah, by price, by many other things. We also have the companies, the corporate users, that they are more aware about the cybersecurity needs. But everybody is speaking about cybersecurity, but not many people know what it means. And that's why probably this regulation, that's why we are, so many people is welcoming the Cybersecurity Act in Europe. Because this is the first stage to start to have people speaking the same language, referring the same things together. And when they address cybersecurity, when they speak about cybersecurity, addressing exactly the same thing. Can we move to the next slide, please? As you probably know, the Cybersecurity Act it's basically defining some risk levels, you know, and it's defining some minimum requirements here and there, which is still not very clear. So we made an interpretation. We understand. We like very much to try to pick this Cybersecurity Act draft or let's say idea and try to understand how the TIC sector, the independent third parties, we can help. And we believe that there is already EU regulation 765, that explains very well what can be the role of our industry on helping not only the European Commission and European society, but also the member states and the need to implement this regulation. So what we believe is that these certain attributes, that is the first thing to define. What means high risk, what means substantial, what means low. Yeah. And this is probably the first discussion that when any person comes into the Cybersecurity Act has questions. Okay, my product, it is high security, it is substantial security, it is maybe low security. I don't have very good understanding what applies to me. And probably this is the first thing that needs to be addressed, the interpretation of what means high, substantial, and low. There is still a lot of lack of education among the consumers and among the companies also, and the manufacturers. I can tell you, this question, it's coming on my desk daily basis, And that's why it's so important to explain to people, well, it depends for what your product is going to use. If it's going to be a small chip and it's going to be for something which is going to be not really critical, fine. But if it's going to be used for something that is really critical and is going to affect millions of people, then you probably are moving into higher interest. And this is probably the first question to solve today. It's still a lot of confusion on high, substantial, and low level. Can we move forward, please? In these regards, we believe that the regulation 765, it's a proven methodology. It is already how we believe that these need to be handled. Okay, understanding that there are today many players already active in this field. We have the national cybersecurity agencies. Sometimes, depending on the country, we have a big player. Can be, for example, Germany, or can be, for example, France, where you have a single big agency who is handling all the cybersecurity questions. But there's also the countries where you have, for example, national security officers, national cybersecurity agencies. Even, for example, for sector, you have defense, you have industry, you have sometimes public sector. Okay, we believe that under the framework of the European accreditation, we can develop a model that can help, okay, accreditation and certification to operate altogether. So the first thing, in our opinion, should be to address what it goes into high sustainability. The second step is who is going to work on what. Yeah, and that's why we believe that the accreditation on 17025 laboratories and on 17065 for those conformity assessment bodies that are going to deliver certificates, this is going to be basically critical to go through the market in a way consumers can understand and manufacturers can understand, because this is a very proven methodology. So this is not new. This is something that has been operating for a lot of places already. And we also, let me to say a question that also is quite important. For the Cybersecurity Act, and we need to understand one thing, this is all about security. So most probably, we will need also to understand that there's going to be a component of security clearance for the companies involved in this activity. So it's not going to come as a surprise that certain levels of security and certain certificates will need to be done, you know, probably with certain level of clearance for the company, for the site, and for the people involved, which is something that today we are tending to sometimes forget. Okay, so it's not only the technical capacity to perform an assessment, but also is the security of the people, company, and the site who is being involved in this assessment. Can we move to the next one, please? And go to the standards and to the frameworks. One of the, and this is something that we are probably, not only in SES, but in the whole TIC industry, we are very concerned. We believe that we are facing sometimes, the danger of the fragmentation and the confusion. One of the problems is that we are seeing in the last months, and let's say the last 2 years, after the Cybersecurity Act final lookalike, many people, proposing new standards, proposing new methodology, and in most cases, very vertical and specific. Okay, this is a standard that we propose for this specific sector, for this specific activity, and we are really worried about the capacity of these standards to live all together in a single environment, because interoperability among the standards, even, for example, same level recognition, is something that is not being done. So that's why probably, based on our experience, we believe that we need to build on existing standards, even if they are far from being perfect. Less number of standards, but with the capacity to grow more in the horizontal level rather than the vertical silos, will help the market to have a clear roadmap what to be done. That's why, in our opinion, we need to build on the existing standards that existing member states are developing. We are very supportive with common criteria. We are very supportive with the lightweight certifications that certain member states, France, Spain, Germany, are developing based on the common criteria methodology. We also are very supportive with DAC 62443, that we believe that this standard will play a relevant role, and with the ISO 27032. So those are the standards that, in our opinion, okay, should be first considered in this new Cybersecurity Act as the relevant ones. Because if in the end we end with a catalog of 60, 50, 40 standards that can be used, then this is going to create really a lot of problems in the market, because it will be really difficult for many people to understand, okay, what is going to be the requirements to fulfill. And also is going to create a lot of cybersecurity gaps, because most probably when a device manufacturer will go to incorporate different components, will not be able to match what is going to be those components' cybersecurity attributes. And we go to the next one. So as a conclusion, and I think that this is something that, if you hear me in other places, I always make the same statements. First, we need to call for less numbers of standards, okay, but with a much more capacity to be used, those standards, on several verticals and product families. So it's very common that sometimes people tell me, okay, but that particular standard, Sergio, has never been tested in this specific domain. Let's do it. Let's do it. But at least we have a common methodology. We are also very worried that we have many efforts in the Commission, in regulatory efforts, which are including cybersecurity requirements in their main bodies. Okay, and sometimes we are feeling some lack of interoperability among those requirements. It's not a surprise that medical regulation, that RED regulation, is calling for cybersecurity requirements. And still many people, even we, don't understand very well how this is going to be more or less encompassed to be a single requirement among all these regulations. Also, we are worried because the sectorial standards and the proprietary standards, which are popping up big time today, these days, okay? We believe that this can create some kind of fragmentation, and we can be really misleading regarding the attributes of security of any device. We are seeing how many people is proposing their own labels with their own names, with their own standards, okay? And we believe that this is really misleading and is creating a real problem because it's basically making certification useless somehow, because no one can understand what is the attribute behind this paper. The industry will play a role, okay, but can play a bigger role helping regulators and member states, okay, to really have scalability. Once a requirement is being set, it's very usual that we have a lot of people wanting to implement. And that's why we believe that the industry can help there. Being able to issue our certificates by our own, being accredited to under the 17 or 65 to do so, and under a short scrutinized by the national member states, national security agencies, okay? And it's because accreditation and the security controls, it's something that the industry can. We can be really the partners that the member states and that the regulators they need to implement the Cybersecurity Act among Europe, and not only among Europe, worldwide. Important thing, we understand very well the time to market. This is really critical in this sector. Not only in this sector, time to market is always a concern for the manufacturers, and it always has been something that the TIC industry find the right balance between time to market and really put the right requirements on the certificates that we issue. That's why I think that we can use the experience of the TIC sector, not only SES, but also my fellow companies, my fellow members of the TIC Council, to help really regulators and member states, but also to the market, to be able to deliver what the Cybersecurity Act is asking for or will ask for, and what basically the consumers and the market is asking for. I don't know if anyone has any questions.
Thank you very much, Sergio, for this comprehensive presentation from the side of the contributions of the TIC sector. We're almost at the top of the hour, so I will only ask one question, and I will ask the panelists to be as prompt as possible in answering these questions, knowing that also we will be happy to take some of the questions that have been asked that we will not get to, and to provide you with some answers on the by email or via different means of communication. So I just wanted to get to the question of Fernando Hardasmal, which is a two-parter. And the first question was whether he is interested to know if there is any specific progress in regards to the alignment with the other key regions or countries such as the US, China, and Japan. And this is a question that also ties into another question that was asked by Borislav Gorgiev, who is asking, who is saying that cyberspace has no borders, and whether we can conduct this activity in the view of the world, talking about close cooperation with ISO, IEC, and with in the framework of the WTO. So, who would want perhaps to take this question on the alignment, on international alignment in terms of schemes?
Yeah. Hi, Martin. This is Aris. I can start.
Yeah.
So in the Cybersecurity Act, I mean, when we were drafting the Cybersecurity Act, one of the documents we used as inspiration were the, let's say, guidance from the WTO on technical barriers to trade and well, on how to avoid technical barriers to trade. And we think we have succeeded in putting some safeguards in the Cybersecurity Act, including a prioritization, let's say, of international standards and European standards. However, the Cybersecurity Act does not exist in a vacuum, and when it comes to products and trade, we in the Cybersecurity Act can do our best, as I said, to rely on international standards, to make use of international accreditation agreements. But of course, global trade issues are discussed at a much higher level between our international partners, both to the east and west. And we hope to benefit, let's say, from agreements reached there, and also fear that we may suffer if those agreements, those broader agreements fail. Because Borislav is correct that cyberspace has no borders and bits and bytes flow freely. That's not always the case on products and services, unfortunately. But again, just the message is that we will try in the schemes themselves to make them as international friendly as possible. But then we are, of course, bound by other discussions and other agreements on the global market.
Thank you very much, Aris. Would anyone care to answer a second question, which will also be the final question? This is a question from a member of a TIC company who asked, how will the cybersecurity schemes fit into or interfere with the current new legislative framework requirements currently being expanded by cybersecurity requirements, such as, for example, the Radio Equipment Directive?
I can...
Yeah. Ari, please go ahead. And
Yeah. Well, there are two parts to the answer. The first one is a legal one, where the Cybersecurity Act itself clearly states that requirements from these schemes cannot or should not, rather, conflict with any applicable legal requirements. And this we took from an ISO document, actually, on the development of certification schemes. The second part of the answer is that what we are seeking is complementarity, in the sense that we can and in principle will identify how a certificate from one of these schemes can be used as demonstration of presumption of conformity in regulation where it makes sense. Now, in the Radio Equipment Directive specifically, it's highly likely that many of the requirements will result in the same, almost the same types of standards that we are considering in certification. So then a certificate is, I mean, it's a perfect fit. You can have a certificate that will also give you the presumption of conformity, but that, of course, has to be clearly spelled out. And we are working very closely with our colleagues in DG GROW, who are developing RED, but also legislation in the area of vehicle safety, where cybersecurity has recently been introduced, but also the medical devices. And I fully agree with Sergio's comment on the need for perhaps better inter-commission cooperation. But we are doing our best in order to create synergies and avoid, of course, conflicts. Thank you, Martin.
Yeah,
thank you.
In these regards, I know the efforts of the Commission, and particularly DG Connect, to try to assemble everything. And I think that in the end, it's going to be super clear that the European Cybersecurity Act should be the apex of the cybersecurity. And honestly speaking, I think that the Cybersecurity Act can cover every piece of regulation in Europe. But it's true also that for example, Radio Equipment Directive is creating a lot of questions in our customers, and that sometimes it's difficult, for example, for us even to reply, because in some cases it's quite confusing. So I think that any effort that the Commission can put on having this framework, because with the European Cybersecurity Act, which is a regulation that has been very well done and very much deserved by many people and many sectors, I think we cannot step back on that discussion again. We have already our cybersecurity framework for Europe, so our job is to look into how to make it mature, rather than coming back to the same discussions if the pipeline regulations in Europe is going to have a small cybersecurity requirements, which in my opinion, I agree with Aris, it's useless.
Thank you very much, Sergio. So we're a bit over our time. I think that in lots of ways the discussion has just started from between the TIC industry, between all the participants online, and with the representatives from the Commission and from ENISA. I think that the presentations that you've shared with us make us look forward to some rich dialogues within the stakeholder cybersecurity certification group, with civil society, and with all the stakeholders in cybersecurity certification. So I want to thank all the participants, Aristotelis Tsafalias, Andreas Mitrakas, Sergio Lomban, for taking the time to share their thoughts today. And I also want to thank all the participants who joined today. Once the webinar is over, we will be sharing the slides with you. We will be sharing the recording of the webinar with you. And we will also collect the last answers that we were not able to answer, and we will, with the last questions that we were not able to ask, and we will get the answers from the panelists, and we'll share all of this with you is a sort of way to continue the engagement that we saw in the webinar today. So once again, on behalf of the TIC Council, I want to thank you for participating in the webinar today. And I wish you a very, very nice remainder of the week. And I encourage all of you to follow us, to follow the TIC Council on Twitter and on LinkedIn. Thank you very much to everyone. Have a nice day.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.